Oh, hi again. Welcome to another remote session. Uh, Now we're going to talk a little bit about human resource management. Particularly today, I wanted to talk to you about the goals of contracts, the risks of contracts, the limitations present in most contracts. So some principles in human resource management, but mostly applied to notions of contract theory. Okay. So the overarching theme of our next lectures are going to be the are going to be to look at the company, at the firm, as comprised of individuals with different roles, different responsibilities, and different incentives. And this last or this last part, the different incentives part, can be tricky, and can give rise to some important problems in management, particularly in human resource management. The goal here is that the objectives of all members of a company, of an organization, these incentives are aligned with each other. That is, we align the objectives of the shareholders, of the managers, and of the employees. Um, the the goal here is that the common goal is that we look at value maximization, this value maximization premise, as the objective for the shareholders, the managers, and the employees, the three groups. We have to align these objectives for three, which is not necessarily what happens if we do nothing. If a company, say, pays a fixed wage and has no incentive whatsoever, the employee will perhaps have an incentive to work a little bit, but not completely kill herself at work. However, if you are a manager of your own business, say you are an entrepreneur, this dilemma seems to go away because the business success to a very large extent will depend on how much work, how much effort you put into that. Okay, so this is particularly a problem of large organizations that have shareholders that are not the managers and managers that are not the shareholders or the regular employees of the company without any administration responsibilities or very few. If the company can align these objectives of the three or the different stakeholders here, what we have is we tend to have higher productivity and profits because we are all contributing for the same objective. Okay, very well. Before we move on into that, however, I want to explore some themes in contract theory. So here we are concerned mostly with contracts between an employer and an employee, but this can truly apply to any kind of contract, you do as a part of a transaction, say for providing a service or even for selling a product, selling a good, etc. So in contracts, what we have is an exchange between parties, and the contracts will stipulate the terms in which this exchange is made. So when, how, for how much, for how long. If we are particularly looking at labor contracts, at employment contracts, we will know that depending on the region of the world you are, there are some terms of this exchange that are stipulated by law. So these conditions are even stipulated by law. In Portugal, for example, any employment contract requires that the place of employment is written in the text of the contract, that the working hours are written in the contract, or if there is an exemption on working hours, that is also spelled out in the contract. There's a requirement also for the full name, say, of the person that is signing the contract, say the employee, is written there. So these are stipulated, are mandated by law. And because they are written explicitly in the contract, we call these explicit contract clauses. Okay. Also, what we see, and these will also feel or fall under the explicit contract clauses is that there are in many contracts, and employment contracts are no exception, um, remedies or clauses that stipulate what happens if one of the parties does not carry its obligations. Say, if the employer doesn't pay the agreed upon wages on time, or if the employee doesn't show up for work and doesn't justify that absence for a given number of days, for example. So these tend to be also explicitly written contract clauses. So this is already providing us some information. This is providing information on the terms of a contract that is fulfilled. So for the fulfillment of the contract, what is required. But we see that many contracts also, or virtually all contracts, also include some clauses for what are the remedies, what are the consequences if one of the parties does not carry out its obligations. Now, in contracts, we have these explicit clauses, but we also often have many implicit clauses. These implicit clauses are voluntary and self-enforcing, and they refer to aspects of the contract that are known and obvious to both parties or to all the parties, and so obvious that there's no need for them to be written out. Say, let me give you an example of implicit contract clause. Say you are celebrating, an employment contract with a consulting company, and you are required as part of that contract, that can be explicit, to many times work at the premises of your client. Your clients will tend to be large organizations. So an implicit clause here may be regarding, say, the dress code. So if you read the contract from the beginning to the end, there may be no single reference to what you should wear to work in the office of the company or in the office of the client. However, implicitly, it is acknowledged between the two parties that, well, if this is a consulting job, the dress code is going to be rather formal. So you would be in breach of contract if, say, you showed up at your client's office in flip-flops and swimming trunks and some t-shirt, and with the sunscreen on your face. So even though you can read the contract from beginning to end, and the best lawyer in the world will not find it there because it's not written, this is an implicit contract clause because it's voluntarily agreed between both parties without even having to mention that things such as the dress code are going to be fulfilled. Okay, so this is an example of an implicit clause here. So what we see is that contracts depend on information and on information exchange. Some information that can be exchanged in writing and in a very formalized and codified form. Some information that can be, for lack of a better word, common knowledge to all parties. And that does not need to be explicitly mentioned. Now, the goal of any contract is to be as complete as possible. That is, to take into account as many possible real-world situations as possible. However, there are some limitations that are extremely obvious or evident, particularly in a time of lockdown as the one we're living when I'm recording these videos, which is many times we cannot completely account for the future. So we have a challenge here. We have to write a contract in the present, and in that present contract, we have to try to anticipate every possible future state of the world in which the contract will apply. And this every that I have put in bold and that I have highlighted is the difficult part. So the lack of gaps in a contract are in practice impossible. Now, even though it's impossible to make completely complete contracts because the future is uncertain and with uncertainty we cannot act, we can try to make them as complete as possible given the circumstances. So that shouldn't stop us from trying to make the contract as complete as possible. So we are going to try to achieve contract completeness, even though perhaps what's the best we can hope for is contract effectiveness. That is to make sure, or to sure is a tricky word here, but to the best of our abilities, try to anticipate every possible scenario so that the contract works. So an effective contract is a contract that works. And the capability of this contract to work will depend on the degree of completeness of the contract and of the completeness of contract law itself, which is outside the scope of the firm, of the company. This is determined by lawmakers. As I said, in real life, all or virtually all contracts are going to be incomplete. And the three reasons for incompleteness are what I want to talk to you about next, and I think are the really cool part of this session. And this incompleteness is due to bounded rationality, to difficulty specifying or measuring performance, and to asymmetric information. So these are three very interesting topics that are covered in contract theory and economics that have given some of the most recent and well-regarded economics Nobel Prizes in recent years. So these are three very interesting aspects. So let's start with bounded rationality. Bounded rationality refers to limits. So a boundary is a limit to reason. Okay. So bounded rationality is a limitation to contract completeness, and is the limitation that individuals have in order to think rationally. We can break down this bounded rationality into three causes. So the bounded rationality itself is a cause that has three antecedent causes. And these antecedent causes are, well, the information individuals have, access to information, cognitive limitations of those making a contract, in other words, how stupid they are, and the finite amount of time they have to make a decision. Okay. These three aspects are extremely important. Let's go through them one by one. So take if the first question here, information they have. Let's look at bounded rationality as you would look at an exam. Information you have. So let's suppose you're making answering a multiple choice question, and in the preamble of the question, where the data for you to answer there is one value that is missing. So there's no way you can get to a conclusion because you have lack of information. That is limiting your ability to give a correct answer. You can tell me, yes, it's limiting me because there was a problem with the question, but reality works just like that. There may be information that you still don't have access to because it simply doesn't exist. So it's a limitation to contract completeness. It doesn't depend on you being stupid or not. It simply depends on the lack of information. Okay? So there's no way, say, during the test, that if you find out that this information is missing, that you can answer correctly to that question. You have a lack of information. The second part, the cognitive limitations of your mind, is perhaps you didn't work too hard to study for this test. Perhaps you were sick and you're not on your best day, your mind isn't as sharp as possible, or perhaps, let's face it a bit sadly, you are not the brightest mind ever to have lived. So these cognitive limitations depend on how smart people are, and we know that, well, sadly, we are not equally smart, and some are more capable than others. So this is the second limitation or the second cause for bounded rationality. finally is the limited amount of time you have to make a decision. Again, using the analogy from the test, well, imagine you have a midterm that you could have, say, a 20 out of 20. If you had 2 hours to do, if you only have 1 hour to do, perhaps you will not be able to get that 20, or very likely you will not be able. So because we have many decisions, in this case, many answers, many questions to answer in a very, very finite amount of time, it is likely that you're going to make some mistakes or leave some questions in as blank because simply you don't have any time. So these are the 3 underlying causes for bounded rationality. Okay? See if you have any questions here. And because any or a combination of these 3 causes to bounded rationality, you may end up drawing contracts that are incomplete. Sometimes because of your own limitations, let's call them your own, say that's your or our, okay, such as these cognitive limitations. Sometimes because of factors that are outside of our control, that we cannot control ourselves, but that still limit our ability to draw a complete contract. Okay. So reason number 2 is the difficulties in measuring and specifying performance. So this reason here is I'm not sure what a completion of the contract or of the objectives of the contract better put are. So I'm having difficulty in measuring, say, success or failure. And sometimes I may have an ability to define the success or failure, but I may have difficulty in measuring it as well. So let's perhaps start by tackling the performance specification. So some tasks are extremely easy to say whether or not they were a success. So if I say my goal is to fix Moodle that is now down, it is not, but let's presume it is, fix some problem with Moodle. Well, if Moodle is back up, then my work was a success. If Moodle is still down, then my work was a failure. So this performance specification in this example is, fairly easy to clear and to write down. So it's an objective performance specification. However, many times performance specifications are a little bit more subjective. So they depend on opinions. So if I ask you, did you like the concert you watched on YouTube streaming the other day? Some people will say it was great. Some people will say it was meh. Some people will say it was garbage. I didn't like it at all. It was complete rubbish. So here it is more difficult to assess what success is. Perhaps the musician is even happy sometimes that people don't like the concert because there's no such thing as bad publicity. But perhaps it's the other way around. They want to have a lot of likes and a lot of interactions with their concert while it's going on in the streaming. So the specification of performance and what does it mean for it to be a success or not here in itself is fuzzy. It's not very clear. What should we be looking at even to specify what success or failure are? The measurement part is associated with this. So you may say, well, my concert was a success. And why do you say that? Well, I saw people and they all looked very happy at the end. Next time you organize a concert, however, no one shows up. So the measurement here, the measures used are a little bit subjective. Perhaps attendance to a concert is an important success measure. Perhaps also having people that go to the concert and enjoy it and look satisfied as they leave is also a good metric for this success measure. But still, it's a little bit more difficult to measure this performance here, rather than measuring the performance of a factory worker making a standardized component in a production line. So imagine you're work is to make light bulbs, and you make 10,000 light bulbs per hour. They're all tested and they're all okay. So you have here a good performance specification, which is the output you make, and you have performance measurement, which is the output you make tested. So you can say that this employee has made 10,000 light bulbs, 10,000 non-defective or working light bulbs in the next or in the last hour. So this is a measure, an objective measure of performance. When, however, the performance measurement is difficult or fuzzy, this may leave those executing the actions and generating this performance to be a little bit lazy. That's what shirking means, meaning that you're being lazy. You can say, tell your friends that today you cannot make it because you're working hard, you're studying. You'll be locked at home. No one will know whether or not you're studying. They will believe you, but perhaps you are instead, I don't know, binge watching on your favorite Netflix TV show. So the measurement, the difficulties in measurement and in observing the actions of these and the intentions of these agents are going to be, we call them agents because they act, of these agents are going to be an important challenge here to performance specification and measurement, and consequently also to contract completeness. Okay. Finally, here we have the third limitation to contract completeness, which is asymmetric information. Why do we call it asymmetric? Because there's information on some parties that not is equally shared. So there's no transparency. There is some degree of opaqueness. For example, I already know what one of the questions in the exam will look like, and you do not. So there is an asymmetry in the information we have regarding this topic. The day after the exam, that asymmetry in information will have disappeared, but at that point in time, perhaps it won't matter so much. Okay, so that's what information asymmetries are important for. And they are a limitation to contract completeness in the sense that the not sharing, the refraining from sharing this information can lead to contracts that disproportionately benefit one part, that do not completely anticipate the future actions of one party or one or more parties. So in this sense, these contracts are going to be incomplete. Okay. So just to follow the slide a little bit more closely, if one party knows something that the other one doesn't about aspects that are important for the contract, then we say that there is an information asymmetry in this contract, and that the knowledgeable party may distort or misrepresent that information. I'll give you some examples in a bit. This is even more compounded because information tends to be costly to obtain, or sometimes even impossible to obtain. But let's just say costly to obtain. Because it is costly to obtain, the party that has lesser information, we will do it, but only to a certain extent. Okay. Then I said I was going to give an example. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're writing down your CV, your curriculum vitae to apply for a company. And the company particularly values that you have a good working knowledge of French. You've learned some French in high school, but you mostly have forgotten about it. But you really, really want to land this job. So when making your CV, and here, no, I'm not being judgmental, you decide, or let me say I decide, to misrepresent my knowledge of French, or perhaps just be overly optimistic on my knowledge of French, and say that I have fluent knowledge of French language, when at best I have very poor working knowledge for, I don't know, asking to buy a train ticket. That's the best I can do. But still I write down on my CV, and the information I share is that I am fluent in French. So here I'm creating an information asymmetry. I am sharing information that is false in this case, that is misrepresenting the facts with the intent of benefiting myself. So I'm telling the company, I'm extremely good at this language, you don't have to worry. When in fact I know, and they don't know, that I'm not so good at this language. Can they figure out? Yes, they can, for example, run a French test and my bluff would be called immediately there. But what's the problem with that? Well, it is costly. Now they have to run a French test on everyone applying to the job because they suspect that some people may be less and completely candid and transparent about their real knowledge of the language. Okay, so that's what this costly to obtain information really means. If you have any question. The existence of known information asymmetries can lead to market failure. So what does this mean? The fact that the company, let's say the company knows that people lie on their CVs, but that there's no way to verify whether or not that is true. Let me make an interesting example. So say that the company or the organization you are applying for is an organization, is like a spy organization or something like that. This spy organization wants to hire people that have prior experience of working in this intelligence service. So you very cunningly, figuring that out, write down on the CV that you have, say, 5 years of experience or 3 years of experience as an intelligence officer in, say, a large agency, the CIA, for example. Because there's no way to verifying this information is classified, there's no way of verifying. The company has no way to figure out, there's no costly way even to figure out whether or not this is true. So what the company is stuck with in this contract is to either take your word for it, which may be a lie, or simply do not ask for this information. So you can see the kind of conundrum that this is creating. Because the parties cannot assess each other's level of information, they cannot trust each other. Because I can say I have 10 years of experience in intelligence, in the intelligence sector, and the company has no way to verify this information. They will doubt this information, but they won't be able to do anything with it. So this can lead to the company not hiring anyone because there's no way for verifying or fact-checking this particular piece of information. Okay, so that's the risk that information asymmetry can lead to. So are there any questions regarding this point or the previous ones? Okay. What kind of market failure would this be? The market failure means that simply there will not be a transaction. So a market failure would be potential employees wanting to get the job, the company wanting to hire people, but this transaction not occurring, the contract not occurring in the first place, because no one is sure whether or not this is the information shared is true, and there's no way of verifying. So this can lead to simply the company not hiring because they cannot verify the information. Okay, so that is what market failure is. The first example, and that gave the author a Nobel Prize to Akharov, was what he called the market for lemons. Not lemons, the fruit lemons, but bad cars. So in American English, it was used, I think the expression doesn't exist much anymore. We used to call cars that had bad performance, that were in bad maintenance condition, we used to call them a lemon, so a bad car. However, what many dealerships did was they would buy a lemon, a car that was complete crap, do a little paint job, trying to hide some of its major issues, but not fixing the fundamentals of the car. And once you went to the dealership and asked for a car, what would the dealer tell you? Oh, this car, it's perfect. The owner was always the same person. She was an old lady in her 80s. She only drove the car to go to service, to go to mass every Sunday. She had a garage, of course she did, and there was no way for us to verify whether or not this was the case. So what this information asymmetry led to was to an increasing distrust of these dealerships that led them to face lesser demand, and with this lesser demand, lower and lower prices. This is the problem of adverse selection. That is correct. The adverse selection, that is the selection of not the fittest but of the worst in a market, is being caused by the information asymmetry between the parties making this contract. So what tends to happen over time for us to have adverse selection? So in the beginning, some of the cars in the dealership will be good cars, some of the cars will be lemons, will be the bad cars. They will sell equally, and the dealer, being smart, will sell them at about the same price. However, some of these cars are going to be, in fact, lemons, and the people that buy them are going to be extremely disappointed and mad at the ones making the transaction. And the word is going to start going around that there's no way beforehand of you knowing whether the car you're looking at is a good car or a lemon or a bad car. So over time, people start to incorporating this information into their purchase of a new car. And what happens? Because they are incorporating this bad information, they are also accounting for the probability of the car being a lemon, so they are willing to pay less because it's a gamble that they're doing. It's a gamble between a good car or a lemon. Because the gamble sometimes doesn't pay off, you will have to work based on an expected value. So the average price of used cars is going to fall a little bit. Because the average price of cars falls, people that have good old cars will be less willing to sell them because they're going to be selling those cars at the same price as lemons. So guess what? Who is willing to still sell these cars at the low price? Well, the owners of other lemons. So over time, if nothing is done to this market, what we observe is that what was perhaps a combination of, say, 50% good cars, 50% lemons, will increasingly become a proportion of, say, 60, 70, 80% lemons and 40, 30, 20% good cars being sold in this market. Is there a way to solve this? Yes, to say, make sure that the information of the car has to be fully shared, that ownership information, maintenance sheets, any repairs done to the car, that this information has to be publicly shared. So this is the way to avoid the market failure that would otherwise occur because of the asymmetric information and the adverse selection that would be generated afterwards. So for student 43251, thank you very much for the question. It's a very interesting one. Any other questions? So if you have no further questions, what I'll do is I'll stop this session now. I will upload our two sessions we had today, the two sets of slides we had today, and I'll see you all on Thursday for some more information here on limitations to contract completeness. Okay, see you then. Bye bye.